you. Thank you for having me here. And I just want to make you aware, Christian, that someone is saying they don't see the links. They may have already passed them. You may need to put them in the chat again.
I'll throw those in there again.
Well,
Thanks.
good evening, everyone. And it is such an honor to see all of your faces. I have scanned both pages so that I can actually see everyone's face. It's my honor and privilege to join you this evening for the Peace and Justice Lecture. And the only complaint I have is that it's 80 degrees where you are and it's 30 degrees where I am. But nevertheless, we are here. It's been a challenging season for us all. We've now crossed the threshold of 1 year of self imposed isolation as a defense mechanism against a pandemic that has ravaged our nation and indeed our world. 538,000 deaths nationally and over 2.5 million deaths globally. The vaccine, of course, offers a ray of hope, but supply is not yet sufficient for demand. We are on our way. So when Canon Christian Gillette reached a few weeks ago and asked what the title of my lecture would be tonight, I quickly responded, God on the Loose: Activism as a Form of Discipleship. I am in the middle of a study on the Gospel of Mark, and I've been spending some time on the baptism of Jesus, and this notion of the sky opening and the Spirit descending, and a voice being heard that says, "You are my son in whom I am well pleased." I was intrigued by that because the literal translation there that we translate as the sky is torn open literally means in the Greek irreparably torn, meaning that it never closes back up. And this connection to God with earth, in a way that we don't often visualize, gives me the image of God being on the loose. Activism, I do believe, is a form of discipleship. And discipleship for me means following the acts and the ministry of Jesus and being the hands and the feet of Christ on this earth, something I consider to be God on the loose. After all, I believe the work of peace and justice to be holy work. The word tzedek, often translated justice in the Hebrew scripture, can also be translated as righteousness. The same word, two similar meanings. Righteousness is the quality of being in right relationship with God and with one another. And what is justice? At least biblical justice, but the same. And in many ways, discipleship will remain the focus of our time together tonight. But I want to confess to you that some things have happened in those 2 weeks. Much has happened since my conversation with Canon Christian. Derek Chauvin has gone on trial for the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Three St. Louis police officers here where I live have gone on trial for beating to the point of deformity a fellow Black officer who was undercover as a protester and they did not know was one of their own. The FBI have paid me a visit to my house to let me know that my actions, which are largely rooted in the church, has made their way to the dark web and began their conversation with me by flashing their badges and asking, was I affiliated with Black Lives Matter? Was I affiliated with Antifa? Was I affiliated with any other leftist organization? They then proceeded to tell me that they had received credible knowledge that there were threats against my life, but they wouldn't tell me who the threats were from. They wouldn't tell me where the credible knowledge came from. And so I am now in the course of trying to figure that out. And then 7 people lost their lives in Atlanta in a lone gunman rampage aimed at Asian owned spas. May those people's lives and the memory of their life be a blessing for all who knew and loved them. All of these instances, my friends, are rooted in racial hatred. So perhaps the place we begin discipleship tonight is with truth telling. Truth telling is also a part of discipleship. For over and over again, we hear Jesus preaching where Jesus says, I know that you've read it says this, but I say this. I know you understand it to mean this, but I tell you this. Over and over again, Jesus challenges us in scripture to expand our knowledge just beyond what we hear, what we've learned, what we've been taught, to expand our knowledge to a spiritual realm of understanding as well. So, in the spirit of God being on the loose, in the spirit of discipleship and activism, I want to spend a little time tonight talking about race. You see, no amount of research into biophysical or genetic features of individuals or groups will explain this social phenomenon that we call race. The position taken by many anthropologists, both biological and social, and increasingly many other scholars in the social sciences, is that race is not even a real thing. Race is neither anthropological, biological, or theological truth. Nowhere in the sacred texts do you find the word race. Race is a cultural and social construct. When 5 white policemen shot Amadou Diallo, a young unarmed African immigrant, 41 times in the doorway of his New York apartment in February of 1999, the officer's actions could not be explained by examining their genes or their biology. And what is sad is there have been so many cases of racial violence since then that most of us don't even remember the case of Amadou Diallo. Nor can we explain some employer's preference for white job applicants or discrimination in housing or any of the other social realities of racism by references to human biological differences. This does not mean that the existence of race as a social construct has no impact on the biology of human beings. On the contrary, we know a lot about the sometimes devastating effects of racism on the biology and the behavior of individuals and groups. Because of several hundred years of racism, during which physical and psychological oppression have characterized the lives and environments of those people seen as members of non white races, differences in health status and lifestyles among them have appeared and continue to impact us all. Even when we began to feel the ravages of COVID 19, it was quickly discovered that COVID 19 was having a greater deathly impact in communities of color. In St. Louis, where I live, we have a street called Delmar Boulevard. And Delmar Boulevard stands as a stark reminder of how deeply impactful racism has been in our region. I can't speak for San Diego, I've only been there as a visitor, but perhaps you have such a street as well. So pronounced are the social, economic, educational, and physical differences across Delmar Boulevard that the street is also known as the Delmar Divide. On the south side of Delmar, we have A plus schools, A plus colleges and universities, lots of green space, golf courses, lakes, jogging trails, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, anything you want on the south side of Delmar. The average home price on the south side of Delmar is about $1 million, $1.5 million. Across the street, literally across the street, on the north side of Delmar, You have boarded up buildings, corner stores for snacks, but no grocers, no hospitals, though you have a few federally qualified healthcare clinics, many fast food restaurants, but no place to buy fresh vegetables, no place to buy healthy food that people should eat. Literally across the street, across the Del Mar divide between the south side and the north side, there is a 26-year documented lifespan difference between a Black man on the north side and a white man on the right side, on the south side of Del Mar. What are some of the lines of demarcation in your area? What are some of the places, perhaps in San Diego, that have been constructed on false notions of race, that have divided people so distinctly that you can call one neighborhood Black or brown or Asian and another neighborhood clearly white? In the middle of the 20th century, a new generation of historians began to take another look at the beginnings of the American experience. They spent decades exploring all of the original documents relating to the establishment of colonies in America. What these scholars discovered was that our 19th and 20th century ideas and beliefs about race did not exist in the 17th century. Race originated as a folk idea, an ideology about human differences. It was a social invention, not a product of science. Therefore, race should only be analyzed as a social cultural reality that exists in a realm independent of biological or genetic variation. Historians have documented when and to a great extent how race as an ideology came into our culture and into our consciousness. This is a part of the story that I want to share tonight. One of the first of the publications, and perhaps the one with the greatest impact, was a book by Edmund Morgan. It's entitled American Slavery, American Freedom. It was written in 1975, and it is the detailed story of Virginia, the first successful colony. On its publication, it was hailed as a classic that has inspired numerous other historians. The establishment of Jamestown in Virginia by English colonists occurred over 400 years ago in 1607. And from the beginning, Jamestown was a crude and a rough and a turbulent community of mostly young Englishmen who came to seek their fortunes with the idea that they would return home. They wanted to emulate the Spanish, to obtain wealth by conquering and enslaving native peoples and forcing them to produce silver and gold. However, the first peoples did not take well to slavery. Many died of European diseases and others escaped to unknown territories. And also, there was another problem. There was no gold and silver immediately available. So the settlers soon discovered a crop, tobacco, whose trade would bring them their wealth. But growing and processing tobacco was really hard work. And the greatest problems of the colonists constantly faced was a lack of labor. Many of the settlers could not do such intensive work, and within a decade, the colony began to import indentured servants, mostly from England. And it was this pattern of servitude that provided a model for slavery that was to come later. Servants were bought and sold and ill fed and ill clothed and poorly housed, and they were punished for the pettiest of crimes. Mortality was high, but surplus was also high. Immigrants wanting to leave England in the early 17th century and had few choices. And if they survived this period of servitude, which usually was about 5 to 7 years in the New World, then they could be set free and they would be allowed to acquire land themselves. But there were many degrees of servitude. So in 1619, the first Africans arrived. And there's been some debate about who they were, but we know that they had Spanish or Portuguese names and they were familiar with European culture already. In the US, it is widely and popularly believed that the colonists brought Africans to the New World enslaved from the beginning, and that Europeans were naturally prejudiced toward Africans because of their physical characteristics, specifically dark skin. But historians now hold that true slavery did not exist in the early decades of the English North. They were familiar with many forms of bond servitude, which they saw as unfree labor. And some men who purchased had rights for laborers who treated them as though they were slaves for life. But formal enslavement that we ended up having, did not exist. Yes, there was brutality. Yes, people were treated unequally. And often, even, servants were called slaves. And the distinction between servitude and slavery was not all clear. Consequently, the first Africans who arrived in Jamestown were not initially uniformly perceived that way. They were assimilated into the colony as laborers under varying contracts, just like those of Europeans, and some of them worked off their debt and became freedmen. A few ambitious men obtained land and livestock, and they bought substantial houses. They married and they established themselves as well to do planters. And there were others who became entrepreneurs and engaged in trading and other commercial activities and had business dealings on equal footing with whites, like their white counterparts. Black property owners were there, and they were often contemptuous of government, arrogant, and insulting towards those considered their social inferiors. In fact, numerous court records provide clear evidence that these 17th century Africans did not act and were not treated differently from whites of the same social class. Edmund Morgan wrote, "There is more than a little evidence that Virginians during these years were ready to think of Negroes as members or potential members of the community on the same terms as other men, and to demand of them the same standards of behavior. Black men and white men worked together. They ate together. No stigma was associated with what we later called intermarriages. Often, Black male servants were married to white women servants. Records from one county reveal that one-fourth of the children born to European servant girls were mulatto. Poor servants who achieved their freedom, though, found it hard to acquire land. The freed poor and the servants, which now included Europeans and Africans and mulattoes and a few indigenous, became unhappy with their lot because they could not buy land because the land had already been taken up. And especially they were unhappy with the corruption and the abuse of power on the part of wealthy men who now ruled the colony. They began to threaten rebellions, and they plundered their neighbors and showed contempt for colony leaders and generated unrest. And in 1676, the most famous rebellion took place. It was led by Nathaniel Bacon. This uprising of thousands of poor workers was the first major threat to social stability. The rebellion dissipated after the death of Bacon, but British royal commissioners sent out to suppress the uprising realized that the population at large had supported the rebellion. On one occasion, they faced a group that was as large as 600 or 700 people who were rebelling against the way they had been treated. They soon recognized that they needed a strategy to prevent such coordination in the future and to ensure that a sufficient number of controlled laborers were available to plantation owners. The decision that the rulers of the colony made during the last decade of the 17th century and the first quarter of the 18th century resulted in the establishment of racial slavery. It was not a decision based on skin color, it was a decision based on wealth. They began to pass a series of laws separating out Africans and their descendants, restricting their rights and mobility, and imposing a condition of permanent enslavement upon them. Africans were now being brought directly from Africa. They were different from earlier Africans in that, ironically, They were considered heathens because they were not Christian and were unfamiliar with European languages, customs, and traditions. Some colony leaders began to argue that Africans had no rights under British laws and therefore could be subject to forced labor with impunity. After 1672, British ships entered the slave trade, and the number of people shipped directly across the Atlantic greatly increased. There were critical reasons for the preference for Africans. As early as the 1630s, planters had expressed a desire for Africans because Africans already knew how to grow corn and to grow tobacco and to grow sugarcane and cotton in their native lands. These crops had been unknown in Europe. And many Africans had knowledge of metalwork and carpentry and cattle keeping and brick making and weaving and leather tanning and many other skills. Colonists soon realized that without Africans, their enterprises would fail. A good example is the history of the colony of Georgia. Ironically, we are still talking about Georgia. This colony was founded in 1732 by followers of John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism, with the objective of settling poor people from Europe. The founders and organizers had an anti slavery policy, and Georgia became the first non slave holding colony. But the experiment failed. The settlers endured hunger and disease and poverty and many deaths, and they soon petitioned the trustees to alter the policy and allow slaves, arguing for their survival. Nearly 20 years after its founding, the act prohibiting slavery was repealed and Georgia began to prosper. European colonists also recognized that Africans lived longer because they were not adjusting to climate in the same way or the environment in the same way. And they were able to produce more work hours, more work efficacy than those settlers who had come over. Moreover, Africans in a foreign land had no powerful allies and no knowledge of the geographical landscape. They were the most vulnerable of all the people of the Americas. Sources of English servants began to decline in the latter part of the 17th century as jobs became available at home. And the slave trade to Africa increased as internal warfare in Africa made more and more people available for enslavement. Leaders of the colonies, all large planters, had two objectives: to impose effective social controls over the population and to provide themselves with cheap and easily controlled labor. They readily perceived that they could use the differing physical characteristics of the population to divide them and to demarcate some people for permanent slavery. Historian Anthony Parent argues that a powerful planter class, acting to further economic interests, deliberately brought a new form of servitude called racial slavery to Virginia over the period of 1690 to 1723. And in this period, hundreds of laws were passed restricting the rights of Africans and their descendants. When I think about that in the context today and realize that there are over 400 laws that are up right now in our legislature to restrict voting rights, to restrict voting rights. In 2021, we are still there. By 1723, free Blacks were prohibited from voting. Colonial leaders were also doing something else. They were laying the basis for the invention of race and racial identities. They began to homogenize all Europeans, regardless of ethnicity, status, or social class. They formed a new category. And the first time the term white rather than Christian or their ethnic names, English, Irish, Scots, Portuguese, German, Spanish, Swede. The first time we see the word white, it appears in the public record in a law passed in 1691 that prohibited the marriage of Europeans with Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes. A clearly separated category of Black as slaves allowed newly freed European servants opportunities to realize their ambitions and to identify common interests with the wealthy and the powerful. Laws were passed offering material advantages and social privileges to poor whites. In this way, colony leaders consciously contrived a social control mechanism to prevent the unification of the working poor. Physical features became markers of racial status. However, the earliest rationale for racial slavery was not difference in physical features, but the identification of Africans as uncivilized. There had been many groups of people who had been called heathens and who had been called uncivilized. Such attitudes generated extreme hatred. We see that happening even now as we watched an administration attach Asian identity to a pandemic that was ravaging the world. And now we are hearing report after report after report of Asian targeted violence because such attitudes generate extreme hatred. There was a period in our history when Native Americans were called savages. But now in the 18th century, by reducing Africans to permanent slavery, prohibiting owners from freeing slaves, prohibiting their education and training, there was a new savage created. From the early 18th century on, negative characterizations of Africans formed part of a new rationalization for enslavement. These became the stereotypes of races and race difference that we inherited in the 19th and the 20th centuries. What colony leaders was doing was establishing unequal groups and imposing different social meaning on them. As they were creating the institutional and the behavioral aspects of slavery, the colonists were simultaneously structuring the ideological components of race. They exaggerated human difference and even invented some that could not be sustained empirically, such as the belief that Negroes had Black brains and blood. From the last decade of the 18th century on, the writers of learned men appeared to proclaim that there was a natural inferiority of Blacks. In the 1860s, slavery ended, but race as a social status and the basis of our human identities remained. Race ideology proclaimed the existence of separate, distinct, and exclusive groups that were made unequal by God or nature. And African Americans, the most inferior, were at the bottom of the hierarchy. European whites, some of them, not all of them, were at the top. Each race was thought to have distinct physical and behavioral traits that were inherited in the blood and passed on to their children. Thus, we have the continuing stereotype of African Americans as lazy, intelligent, violent, oversexed, loud, irrational, musical, emotional, superstitious. And we've watched those images morph over time. We watched during the enslavement of people images of happy Blacks dancing as though there would be any reason to be happy if one is enslaved. And as we got closer to emancipation and closer to some modicum of freedom, we watched those images change from happy and dancing to violent and fierce and hypersexed and to be feared. Those images drove fear of white women not being safe in the presence of Black men. Many images. Even I'm 58 years old. I was educated in the South, born in the South in Birmingham, Alabama. And I was educated largely in white institutions where I had many friends because children don't hate until they learn to do so. White institutions where I was asked questions like, what color is my blood? What color is my brain? not out of hatred, out of the curiosity of children trying to discover other children in their midst. It was believed back then that race differences could not be transcended or transformed. And some days, I believe that they still can't be transcended or transformed now. But yet, I hold out hope. I hold out hope because of opportunities like this. I hold out hope because there are people in the church who are committed to living an anti racist ethos. An anti racist ethos that doesn't mean that we might have all diversity in every setting. That may not ever happen. But we don't have to have all representation to live from a spirit of anti racism. We don't have to have all representation to live with the spirit of an open table and open doors in our church. We don't have to have all representation to begin to deconstruct theologies that don't make room for others, to deconstruct theologies of chosenness that would suggest, even theologically, that God favors some people over other people, a theology that we take out of the sacred text and begin to live in our political spectrums, in our neighborhoods, in our educational systems, in our housing decisions. Both whites and non whites have been scarred in their daily lives by the racial images, by the racial ideations, by the messages that we have all been conditioned to receive. Blacks were stripped of their country, their names, and their culture through slavery. Indigenous people, Indians, Hawaiians, even first people of Australia have been robbed of their land and subjugated on the land of their birth. White people have been robbed of the beauty of their ethnicities, of their ability to stand firmly in all of their identities and not just be lumped together by the color of one's skin. These disparities, these harms that I list to you, I suggest they are not a function of race, but they are a function of racism. Pathology is not endemic to Black people or to poor people, though the dominant culture has too often found it as such. And the sin of racism has had deleterious effects on those that identify as white based on the color of their skin by creating in too many an internalized expectation of superiority that is both non existent and not achievable. Racism is a sin with a root system that so acutely damages us, all of us, all over the world, and cannot be contained in designated locations, nor can it coexist with other viable, life giving ways of being in this world. So I come to this place of understanding my role in activism, my role in protest, my role in justice, to not be to advocate for one group over another, but to advocate from my theological grounding that we are all created by the same God. We're all breathed with the same breath. We're all shaped in the same image. And that, my friends, is what drives me to the front lines when people are being targeted because of the color of their skin. That is what drives me to the front lines when we live in a country that has more than enough and we refuse to make sure everyone has enough. That is what drives me to the front lines when I see legislation that would suggest that because a child is born in a body that they do not recognize, that they don't deserve the care and the love and the attention that every child deserves. This is why I say that activism is a form of discipleship because racism is an evil. And discipleship is meant to confront evil, to cause us to walk and live in the same patterns of the one we say we serve, Jesus, who always made room for those that others left out, who always took the time to heal the hurts that others were having, who always operated with a concept that there is a theology of sufficiency that says if we treat creation the way we're supposed to, and if we share with one another the resources that we have amassed, that there is more than enough for all of us. And while I was just going to talk about God being on the loose, I think in this time when we are facing so much racialized hatred, I think in this time when we are facing so much skepticism about one another, that discipleship must begin with truth telling. And the truth is, race is not a real thing, but racism is killing us all. Thank you.
Amen.
Amen. Wow. Thank you so much, Reverend Blackmon. That was so powerful and so meaningful. And this will give us so much to talk about and think about and pray about and act on. I so appreciate you being here. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You do too. You've inspired us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, at this time, I will post the links to the breakout sessions one more time in case somebody still needs those. But at this point, everyone is invited to head over to the session that you signed up for, either with Reverend Rebecca DeNovo or breakout session 2 with Reverend Janine Scanoni and Deanne Rios. So I will post those links for you and feel free to head over there.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.